Greetings. In the last mini lecture, I talked about the British monarch, and I believe that even though the monarch doesn't have formal political power, the monarch gives the people someone to rally around during a time of crisis. They symbolize national unity. They are a source of historical continuity. After all, Queen Elizabeth's family has been the royal family of Great Britain for over 300 years. And so I do believe that the monarch plays kind of a psychological cement for the country. But as I pointed out in the last mini lecture, in Britain there are two executives. One is the ceremonial, or what I call the dignified. Certainly, your book uses that term, the dignified part of government. And now we turn to the prime minister, who is the efficient part of government, who is the head of government. And as chief executive, the prime minister is the linchpin of the political system, is the most powerful individual in British politics. The prime minister is a working politician that, in theory, has near dictatorial powers, although we're going to find out that in political practice, the prime minister actually has multiple avenues that they have to really patrol to make sure they're not thrown out of office. Unlike the American president, who can really only be thrown out of office in a bid for reelection, the prime minister can be voted out by the people in an election, can be pressured to resign by the party, or can actually be cast out of office by the parliament in a no confidence vote. And one of the things that you're going to notice when I go through some of these prime ministers later on is that some of them have had incredibly short tenures in office before they were deposed, usually from their own party or defeated in a general election. So, what are some of these powers that make the prime minister look so formidable in theory? And then we'll get to the practice later on. So the prime minister picks the cabinet. Okay, that appears to be like an American president. The prime minister is going to head the largest party in the House of Commons. Now, this may not be true in the United States. You may have a president who actually has to face a Congress of the other party. We call this divided government in the United States. The prime minister is not going to have to worry about that. There is incredibly strict party discipline in the House of Commons, which means that because of fusion of powers, because there aren't obstacles that the minority party can throw up, the prime minister can get nearly their entire legislative agenda passed into law. In fact, since World War II, since 1945, nearly 97% of the prime minister's policies have been implemented into law, something that no American president is able to do. I did point out some other strengths of the office of the prime minister. They can obviously fire or dismiss officials. They can determine the agenda of the cabinet. They have the opportunity to select the top civil servants in each department. But in reality, to me, the major strength of a prime minister is the prestige that's attached to being the leader of the majority party, because a prime minister typically has been in the House of Commons for a long time, has served as a junior minister and as a senior minister, and has demonstrated significant political skills in order to rise to the top. Very different than in the United States, where an individual may not even have to have served in government at all, for example. Donald Trump had never served in a political office before he became president. Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, had never served in a governmental role before he became president, for example. Presidents can be governors and rise to the top, senators rise to the top, vice presidents rise to the top. But in the British case, and I'll talk about this more later, the only route to becoming prime minister in Great Britain is through the House of Commons. And so these people, by the time they become prime minister, they have developed a following, they have significant prestige, and it gives them significant persuasive power. I now turn to limitations on the power of the prime minister because Roskin makes the point that I made above, that in theory the prime minister has near dictatorial powers, but in reality this isn't true. There are a lot of limitations on the power of the prime minister. I will go through your notes and add as I usually do along the way. So the first one is the prime minister must face elections at least every 5 years. Roskin says that means that prime ministers are often kind of moderate in their proposals because they don't want to arouse public resentment. To a degree, that's true, although we certainly see prime ministers who have pushed the envelope policy-wise. Certainly the current prime minister, Boris Johnson, is very controversial, has certainly raised a lot of resentment over some of his positions on Brexit. Margaret Thatcher certainly was someone who tried to pull her party along. In fact, Margaret Thatcher's nickname was Tina, for there is no alternative. She was also called the Iron Lady. But I would agree that the fear of losing the next election, what was called the rule of anticipated reactions, does keep most prime ministers cautious. And one of the reasons for this is that a British prime minister is more likely to lose a bid for re-election than an American president. Now, this seems like a strange statement. We just had an American president, Donald Trump, lose his bid for re-election to Joe Biden. But in recent years, this is the first time this has happened for a while, because our previous three presidents all prevailed, right? Barack Obama won his bid for re-election. George W. Bush won his bid for re-election. Bill Clinton won his bid for re-election. Before that, yes, George Bush Sr. or George H.W. Bush did lose his bid for re-election. But before that, Ronald Reagan won. So in recent years, presidents have tended to win bids for re-election. But if you look at the statistics in your notes, winning re-election in Britain is little better than a coin flip. The prime minister has won 12 of the last 20 elections that we've had since 1945. So 60%. So certainly the odds aren't that great. I pointed out something that I think Roskin should have spent more time on, and that is one of the most significant differences. In fact, it's huge. It stands out to me. It should be heavily emphasized. One of the most significant differences between the Prime Minister of Britain and the American president is that 9 people have become Prime Minister during the middle of a parliamentary term rather than after a national election. And I didn't put this in the notes, but if you look at the last 2 Prime Ministers of Britain, both of them, Theresa May, she became Prime Minister when David Cameron resigned in 2016. And the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, became Prime Minister in 2019, in July of 2019, when Theresa May resigned. And so That's huge. Nine prime ministers have taken over from a prime minister that has resigned. And I gave a couple of other examples, probably the most famous, and I used Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair because they are considered the most successful British prime ministers since World War II. They are the only two prime ministers in Britain to win three consecutive elections in Britain since World War II. Margaret Thatcher, of course, was a conservative, and yet she was pressured to resign by her own party, and John Major became prime minister in the middle of her term. The same thing happened to Tony Blair. He was pressured to resign by his own party, and Gordon Brown became prime minister in the middle of a term. Now, certainly, as the notes point out, certainly this is possible in the United States. But usually, presidents that have taken over in the middle of a term in the United States, it has usually been because presidents have died in office. So Harry Truman took over when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. Or Lyndon Johnson became president when President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. The one example that I noted that looks a bit like Great Britain is when Gerald Ford became president because Richard Nixon resigned in 1974. However, Richard Nixon is the only president to resign in office. Gerald Ford is the only person to become president because of the resignation of a president. And I've told you that in the last 5 years, in 2016, a British prime minister resigned, and in 2019, a British prime minister resigned. And 9 of them have resigned since World War II. So certainly that is a huge difference. In many cases, people take over upon the resignation of their predecessor, and of course, they are taking over from a president of their own party who has resigned, and in many cases, their party is in trouble in the polls. So I did also note that in theory, I said that prime ministers appear to be incredibly powerful, and yet, if you take a look at the list, and I updated the list of prime ministers because your book ends with David Cameron, who was elected prime minister in 2010. Your book doesn't mention Theresa May and Boris Johnson, so I updated that in the notes for you. But what's interesting to me is if you look since World War II, there have been 16 British prime ministers, and we are now on the 14th American president since the end of World War II. It's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. First, there are no term limits on British prime ministers. I told you that both Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair won 3 terms in office. In the United States, we have term limits. A president can only serve 2 terms, which is going to be 8 years. The British Prime Minister serves a 5-year term, the American President a 4-year term. And yet, British Prime Ministers on average have served less tenure, and they've had slightly more turnover, which is a bit surprising until, again, you realize that a British Prime Minister can be voted out of office by the Parliament, pressured to resign, or voted out of office by the people. And American presidents tend to have more job security. I will talk a bit about the next set of limitations on the power of the Prime Minister in the next mini lecture.